So we're back in my kitchen today. It's time for another video, and today I'm making bread. More importantly, I'm going to discuss with you all the things I've realized that I've been doing wrong with making bread. Now, don't get me wrong, the bread I was making was turning out okay. It was usually a little more dense than I'd like, and it was usually more crumbly, hadn't risen as much as I'd like, and was usually a bit tough. It just wasn't as good as I thought it could be. And one of my co-workers makes really nice bread, and I quizzed him on everything he was doing. I watched what he does when he makes it, and I couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong. And the truth of the matter was that I wasn't doing things wrong exactly, but I wasn't doing them 100% correctly. So in this video, we're going to look at what I was doing wrong making bread. My name is Stephen, and this is my channel, Heart's Delight Exports. So I got my recipe thumbtacked to the wall, so I got it at easy reference point. You would think at this point that I'd have it memorized, but that's not really one of the things I'm good at. I don't tend to memorize recipes really good. So one of the first things that I was doing wrong in making bread was actually the temperature of the water. My recipe calls for 3.5 cups of warm water. And I was starting out exactly that way. I was being very careful not to have it too hot, because having it too hot can kill the yeast and you won't get the bread to rise correctly. Well, that's part of what I was doing wrong. I was actually starting out too cold. It was only barely lukewarm, only barely as warm as it should be. So the yeast was activating, but it wasn't activating as well as it could have, and it's one of the reasons that the bread didn't rise well enough, or rise as well as it should have. Now, since we've been shut in kind of thing, I've been practicing making bread. I've watched a bunch of videos, and I'm trying to get a handle on what exactly I'm doing wrong. So one of the first things I do now, and my bread has been turning out better, I think, because of this, is that I actually start with hot water. Not boiling hot or anything, but straight from the tap, hot water. Because once I put it in the bowl and I stir in my sugar to completely dissolve the sugar in the water, and then put the yeast in, by the time I follow those couple of steps, the water is just a good temperature for the yeast, and everything starts working right. So next I need a 1/4 cup of sugar. Now I'm going to give that a stir to make sure that it's all nicely dissolved. This is one of the areas that I was losing temperature before. Next to yeast. Now before the yeast gets a chance to activate too much here, I'm going to give it a bit of a mix up, break up any clumps that are there, and get everything good and dissolved. Turn on the light, because that should help. Now I need to leave it alone for a while. This is one of the areas I was also having trouble with. Alright, so we've already hit a few things that I was doing wrong. Water temperature wasn't hot enough. The sugar wasn't being dissolved in the water. I was just dumping it in and letting the yeast do the work. After that, I wasn't mixing in the yeast, so I was having clumps of yeast on the top of the water that wasn't activating. I had thought at the time that this would be okay, that during the mixing process that this would all get mixed in through and the yeast would activate. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. I don't know for sure because I'm not an expert at making bread or any other baking for that matter. So I have temperature hotter on my yeast. I mixed in the sugar to make sure it was dissolved, and then I give the yeast a bit of a mix with the fork to make sure that all the yeast got wet. Now I'm going to set it up for a time lapse so that you can watch the yeast activate. Now, this was one of the other areas that I was having problems with. I wasn't leaving it long enough for the yeast to activate as much as it should. So let's watch some yeast. So the yeast has risen about where we want it to be. Right, so now the recipe calls for 3 cubes of unsalted butter at room temperature, and I don't have unsalted butter. I've never had unsalted butter. I just been using margarine. I just drop it in. It's important to notice that when I drop in the butter, it kind of disappears into the yeast. Now I need to start adding the flour. So have you caught the mistake I almost made? If you don't add salt, your bread will taste unusually dull. Now that's 8 cups of flour in there, and that might be enough, but usually I have to add at least another cup, sometimes 2. No, I don't have a fancy mixer. I have a wooden spoon and arm strength. So you start mixing it up, and it starts coming together. It's a bit of a messy lump at first. So I have a cup of flour ready on hand, and the wooden spoon has reached the end of its usefulness here. Still a nice bit of flour in the bottom that hasn't been absorbed yet, hasn't been mixed in through. So it's important to keep pulling that up, putting it on top of the ball and kneading it into the ball of dough. Sometimes you'll get big chunks of the dough. Just knead it in. Adding a little bit more flour as I go. Make sure to rub your hands together every once in a while to take off the extra dough that's sticking to your hands. I was making that mistake a bit and just losing that dough. Now, there's about where you want to be in the bowl. So now it's time to move out of the bowl. Now I need to knead it up a bit more. that means it's too wet. So more flour on the countertop. Roll it around and vent some frustration. You want to keep rolling the bread dough around until it forms a ball nice and easily and it's not overly ripping up. I got a bubble on the top here that's ripping a bit, but that's not a big deal. So now it's nice and good. So the bowl that I mixed it in. This is something else. I'm not sure if it was a mistake or not, but I was using vegetable oil before, and I was coating the bowl with it nice and good, but it seemed to be, I don't know, maybe too heavy. So now I have the bowl greased up. I have the top of the dough ball greased up. I used about 8.5 cups of flour. Might have been a small bit more. So another thing that I seemed to be doing wrong was that I was covering it in plastic at this point and waiting for it to rise. I've tried various things to get the bread to rise nicely at this point. Most of them fail. This one seems to work. Get the water running nice and hot. My towel is saturated. Squeeze out all the water I can so that my towel won't drip when I hold it up. So I want it damp and warm. And I lay that over the top of my bowl. And I'll now move you, and then I'll lay that in the back, on the back element of the stove, out of the way. Put another towel on top to give it some warmth. Now I have the oven on. The vent burner is this one. I've made the mistake before of various ways trying to put the bread on the vent burner to try to get that heat from the vent to the bread to help it rise. Usually that just starts cooking the dough and makes a mess. That usually ruins at least part of the bread because it's cooked. It's not doing well that way. That's the next mistake that I was making. I was trying to rush the rising of the bread too much. I was trying to induce heat into the dough in ways that were cooking the bread dough. It was killing the yeast before the yeast had a chance to really work. You want a nice warm, damp environment for the yeast to grow. So now it's the next hard part, being patient and waiting for the bread to rise. Okay, so now that the bread dough has risen this much, it's time to start dividing it down. Okay, so now I'm just gonna punch it down. This is what it means to punch down the bread dough. Knock all the air out of it so that it just collapses. Take my knife. And divide it down into quarters. My bread pans are here. It's very important that these get greased. Usually I just brush them with oil that would work just fine. But lately I've had spray grease and I've been using that instead. This one I'm going to do a 3-loaf loaf of bread. Keep folding in the ends, making sure that they get good and tucked in and stuck back together. So that's the outside of the loaf. That's the bottom of the loaf. Now, I'm going to wet down my cloth again. I'm going to make sure that the towel is only loosely over the bread pan, because I don't want it to be so tight that it's restricting the yeast from being able to rise the bread. Okay, so this part is going to take about an hour for it to rise again. Some very nice and soft looking bread. So now just before I put it in the oven, the oven is set to 400 degrees, and I'm going to put it at the timer on for 25 minutes. Okay, so now that the bread is in the oven, it's time to go over the mistakes that we know I was making. The water wasn't warm enough to activate the yeast. The sugar wasn't being dissolved in the water. That doesn't help the yeast activate. What was it after that? I wasn't giving the yeast long enough to activate. I was mixing the yeast in so there was dry clumps of yeast. So there's a few problems there with the yeast in general. I wasn't starting to feel weird now listing all these problems. I wasn't mixing the bread thoroughly enough. I wasn't covering and keeping the bread warm and moist in a good way. I was commonly overcooking. I was commonly cooking the bread while I was trying to get it to rise. That's not a good thing at all anyway. But the way I was doing it was commonly getting it to cook when it was supposed to be rising. I wasn't giving it enough time while it was supposed to be rising, trying to speed up the process. Some things take as long as they take, and you should let them take that time. Now, one of the other things that I was doing wrong that I haven't said yet was the temperature of the oven. I commonly got the oven going most of the day while the bread is on the stove to rise, to bring up the temperature, to have that temperature going. I no longer keep it as hot as what I used to. I now keep the oven temperature set to about 200 degrees while it's rising. Once it's finished rising, like right now it's in the oven to cook, this is another problem that I had, that I wasn't cooking it at a hot enough temperature. I was cooking it at a lower temperature for longer, which it worked out okay, but it wasn't as good as it should have been for nicely golden brown bread. So now I cook it at a hotter temperature. My recipe still says 375, but I usually cook it at 400 degrees, 20 to 25 minutes. So once it comes out of the oven, I'll brush it with butter and I'll let it cool down, usually on a rack, but it does spend a little bit of time in the pan, just sitting there letting it cool down. I'm not in a rush anymore to take it out of the bread pans and put it on a rack. It's taken a bit to get to that point, but I'm not trying to get it to cool down that fast anymore. It'll cool down in its own way. The real danger there is that leaving it in the bread pan will tend to make it a little soggy. Trapped steam in the pan will condensate in the pan, and you'll get areas, especially the corners of the pan, the bread will get a bit soggy as it's cooling down. So you best to avoid that before it gets that far along. But that's what I've learned about making bread since we've been quarantined. So now I make nice, soft bread. It's disappearing out of the freezer at a good rate. The family is all enjoying it, which is good because the bread as I was making it before was heavy and dense, and the only time anybody liked it was when we were making French toast. It didn't turn out the best. So now I make much nicer bread. It's soft and nice. It's good eating bread. I don't know if it rivals my friend at work. Maybe on my best day and his worst day. Something like that. That's the end of another video for Heartsy Light Exports. I'm Steven. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hopefully it taught you something. Maybe it'll help you realize where maybe you were making the same mistake I was. If you've seen another mistake that I've made, something that I can do to improve my bread making, by all means leave it in the comments down below. I'm always glad to get a comment from people, and I hope to see you in the next video.
Gotta have a clean workspace, Dad. That's rule number one.
Uh-huh.